There are moments in life when connection does not arrive politely or logically. It enters unannounced, disrupting the structures we believe defined us. This person did not fall in love with you by accident, nor did the difference in years emerge as a mistake. What unsettles you now is not the age gap itself, but what it awakens within you: a confrontation with time, identity, and the parts of yourself that had been dormant. Love, when it is genuine, bypasses social categories. It recognizes something older than culture and deeper than conditioning. This person saw you not through the lens of age, but through the resonance of psyche. They were drawn to the aspects of you that are timeless, the qualities that existed long before roles, expectations, or fear taught you how to hide. The discomfort you feel is a signal, not a warning. It is the psyche announcing that something meaningful is taking place. The mind wants order, justification, and safety, but the soul speaks in disturbance and intensity. When two inner worlds recognize each other, logic often arrives late to the conversation. This connection forces you to look honestly at your own relationship with maturity, authority, vulnerability, and desire. Perhaps you have defined yourself too rigidly, too young, too old, too late, too early. Yet love dismantles such boundaries, not to destroy you, but to integrate what has been split. What you resist here may be precisely what seeks to make you whole. Divine guidance does not always whisper comfort. Sometimes it insists you pay attention, not to act impulsively, but to listen deeply, to ask what this connection reveals about your unlived life, your suppressed needs, and the parts of yourself that still long to be seen without masks. This is not about defying morality or surrendering to fantasy. It is about consciousness, about recognizing that the soul uses relationship as a mirror. Whether this bond becomes a path you walk or a lesson you integrate, its purpose is awakening. And awakening always begins where certainty ends. Love is often misunderstood as an agreement between roles rather than a recognition between souls. Age, in this sense, becomes one of the most visible roles society assigns: young or old, experienced or inexperienced, mentor or student, protector or protected. Yet when love arises from a deeper place, it does not consult these labels. It responds to something more essential, a resonance that precedes biography. When two people recognize each other at this level, the question of age feels secondary, almost irrelevant, because what is being met is not a stage of life, but a quality of being. The soul does not measure time the way the mind does. It does not keep records of years or compare timelines. Instead, it recognizes patterns of depth, familiarity, and truth. This is why some connections feel strangely ancient, as though they existed before the present moment. When love recognizes the soul, it is responding to emotional intelligence, inner maturity, and psychological presence rather than outward markers like age or status. A younger person may carry a depth shaped by suffering or reflection, while an older person may still be learning the vulnerability required for genuine intimacy. The soul responds to readiness, not chronology. Roles are useful for social order, but they become limitations when mistaken for identity. Age-based roles tell us how we are supposed to behave, what we should desire, and whom we are allowed to love. When a connection challenges these expectations, discomfort arises. This discomfort is often misinterpreted as a sign of wrongdoing, when in truth it may signal the collapse of a false structure. Love that recognizes the soul disrupts the comfort of predictability, because it refuses to conform to narratives that keep us psychologically contained. Such love forces an encounter with authenticity. When age roles dissolve, individuals can no longer hide behind what they are supposed to be. They must face who they are. This can feel exposing, even threatening, because it removes the protection of socially approved identities. Yet it is precisely this exposure that allows intimacy to exist. The soul does not fall in love with performance. It responds to presence, honesty, and the courage to be seen without guarantees. This kind of love also reveals how often we confuse control with safety. Age-based expectations offer a sense of order, a way to predict outcomes and manage risk. When love ignores these boundaries, it reminds us that meaning cannot be fully controlled. The psyche resists this reminder, preferring rules over uncertainty. But growth has always required stepping beyond what is familiar. Love that recognizes the soul invites expansion, not recklessness, but a deeper responsibility to act with awareness rather than fear. When the soul is recognized, love becomes less about possession and more about witnessing. It does not seek to use the other to fill a void or confirm an identity. Instead, it acknowledges the other as a separate, conscious being on their own path. Age loses its dominance because what matters is mutual recognition, the meeting of two inner worlds, capable of reflection, choice, and respect. In this space, love becomes an encounter with truth rather than a negotiation of roles. Discomfort is often interpreted as a warning, something to be eliminated as quickly as possible. From early on, we learn to associate unease with threat, believing that peace exists only where tension is absent. Yet, psychologically, discomfort frequently appears not when something is wrong, but when something familiar is dissolving. It arises at the boundary between who we have been and who we are becoming. In this sense, discomfort is not an enemy of well-being, but a messenger of inner movement. The psyche is built around patterns. These patterns create stability, identity, and predictability. When life introduces an experience that challenges these structures, the mind reacts with resistance. That resistance is felt as anxiety, confusion, or emotional tension. The discomfort does not necessarily point to danger, it points to change. Inner transformation requires the loosening of old assumptions, and the mind rarely releases them without protest. What feels unsettling is often the collapse of an outdated inner arrangement, rather than the presence of real harm. Growth demands contact with the unknown. The known self, even when limiting, feels safe because it is familiar. When transformation begins, the psyche enters territory without a clear map. Discomfort emerges as the mind attempts to protect identity from dissolution. This protective response is instinctive, but it is not always accurate. It confuses unfamiliarity with threat. Psychological danger is associated with loss of integrity or coercion, while transformative discomfort arises from expanded awareness and increased responsibility. There is a subtle but crucial difference between pain that diminishes and discomfort that enlarges. True danger contracts the self. It leads to numbness, fear, or a shrinking of inner life. Transformational discomfort, however, intensifies awareness. It sharpens perception and demands reflection. It does not erase the self, but stretches it. The tension exists because the psyche is reorganizing itself around a broader truth, one that cannot be integrated without temporary instability. Avoiding discomfort may preserve short-term comfort, but it often delays growth. When the psyche repeatedly encounters signals for change and suppresses them, these signals grow louder. Anxiety deepens, dissatisfaction spreads, and inner conflict intensifies. The discomfort was never the problem. The refusal to engage with it was. When approached consciously, discomfort becomes informative. It asks questions that comfort never will. It reveals where attachment has replaced authenticity and where fear has disguised itself as caution. Transformation requires participation. Discomfort invites the individual to observe rather than react, to inquire rather than escape. When held with awareness, it becomes a transitional space where old identities loosen and new possibilities emerge. This process cannot be rushed, and it cannot be avoided without consequence. The psyche matures not through constant ease, but through conscious engagement with tension. To mistake discomfort for danger is to misunderstand the language of the inner world. The psyche does not communicate in absolutes or guarantees. It communicates through sensation, emotion, and disturbance. When discomfort arises in the absence of real threat, it often marks the threshold of growth. It signals that the inner life is expanding beyond its previous limits, preparing the ground for a more integrated and conscious self. An age difference in a meaningful connection rarely carries its power on the surface alone. What unsettles the psyche is not the number of years between two people, but what those years are believed to represent. Age becomes a symbol loaded with assumptions about authority, value, attractiveness, relevance, and legitimacy. When a relationship crosses this symbolic boundary, it exposes beliefs that have long operated silently in the background of identity. These beliefs are often unexamined, inherited from culture, family, and personal history, yet they shape how worth is measured and how the self is perceived. Many people unconsciously tie their value to age-based narratives. Youth may be equated with potential, desirability, and opportunity, while age may be associated with decline, limitation, or invisibility. When an age difference disrupts these narratives, it forces the psyche to confront contradiction. A younger person may discover that they are taken seriously in ways they were told they would not be. An older person may realize they are desired beyond the roles of wisdom or stability they were assigned. These realizations challenge deeply held beliefs about what makes a person valuable. Identity is often constructed around social approval. Age provides a convenient structure for that approval, offering clear milestones and expectations. When a connection ignores these expectations, the individual may feel shame, fear of judgment, or self-doubt. These reactions do not arise from the relationship itself, but from internalized rules about who one is allowed to be at a certain stage of life. The discomfort reveals how much identity has been outsourced to external validation rather than grounded in inner truth. An age difference can also expose unresolved issues around power and dependency. Cultural narratives often assume imbalance where age differs, even when emotional maturity and psychological responsibility are shared. This assumption can trigger internal conflict, especially for those who have struggled with autonomy or self-worth. The psyche begins to question whether love is earned, permitted, or deserved. These questions are not about the other person, they are about the self, as relationship to worthiness. For some, the age difference awakens fears of inadequacy or irrelevance. For others, it surfaces guilt or a sense of illegitimacy. Both reactions point to an identity built on comparison rather than integration. The psyche has been taught to measure itself against timelines instead of inner development. When a relationship defies these timelines, it reveals how fragile such measurements are. Worth, it becomes clear, cannot be sustained by social categories alone. This exposure, though uncomfortable, is psychologically valuable. It brings unconscious beliefs into awareness, where they can be examined rather than obeyed. The age difference acts as a mirror, reflecting the gap between who one believes they should be and who they actually are. In this reflection, the individual is invited to reclaim authorship over their identity. When worth is no longer dependent on age, role, or approval, it begins to root itself in authenticity, presence, and self-recognition. A meaningful connection often arrives not to complete us, but to reveal us. When someone evokes a strong emotional response that feels disproportionate to the length or logic of the relationship, it is rarely about the other person alone. Such a connection functions as a psychological mirror, reflecting aspects of the self that have been pushed aside, denied, or silenced in order to adapt, survive, or belong. What draws you in is not merely who they are, but what they awaken within you. Throughout life, parts of the self are shaped by approval and rejection. Qualities that are welcomed are cultivated, while those that threaten belonging are suppressed. Over time, identity becomes selective. You learn which traits are acceptable and which must remain hidden. These suppressed aspects do not disappear, they wait. When a connection forms that feels unusually alive, it is often because the other person embodies or invites precisely those qualities you were taught to restrain: spontaneity, tenderness, ambition, sensuality, vulnerability, or depth. The psyche recognizes itself before the mind does. This is why such connections can feel unsettling or intoxicating at once. You are encountering a version of yourself that has been neglected. The emotional intensity arises because the suppressed self seeks reintegration. The other person becomes the catalyst, not the cause. They hold up a mirror that reveals your unlived life, the roads not taken, and the parts of you that have remained in potential rather than expression. Resistance often follows recognition. The ego invested in maintaining a coherent identity may interpret this activation as danger. Questions arise about appropriateness, timing, or logic. Yet beneath these concerns lies a deeper fear that acknowledging these suppressed aspects will require change. To integrate what has been denied means loosening the identity that was built around adaptation. This threatens the stability of the familiar self, even if that self has become constricting. Projection plays a powerful role in these dynamics. You may attribute qualities to the other person that feel almost magical or transformative. In reality, these qualities resonate because they exist within you in latent form. The connection feels meaningful because it restores contact with inner vitality. It reminds you of who you might have been, or who you still could become, if fear and conditioning were no longer in control. This mirroring is not meant to trap you in longing or dependency. Its psychological purpose is awareness. When the reflection is recognized, the task shifts inward. The energy that was invested in the connection can be reclaimed and used to integrate the suppressed self into conscious life. This may alter how you relate not only to this person, but to your own desires, boundaries, and sense of agency. Such connections do not demand that you abandon reason or responsibility. They ask for honesty. They invite you to see yourself more completely without the filters of expectation or self-censorship. When the mirror is understood, the connection fulfills its deepest function. It restores wholeness by revealing the truth that was waiting to be acknowledged. Divine guidance is often imagined as gentle affirmation, a calm inner voice that reassures and confirms what is already comfortable. People expect signs that soothe uncertainty and validate existing choices. Yet psychological and spiritual experience repeatedly reveals a different pattern. Guidance that leads to growth rarely preserves the status quo, it interrupts it. What feels disruptive is often the very mechanism through which deeper alignment is initiated, because transformation cannot occur without disturbing what has become rigid or false. The human psyche is deeply invested in stability. Even when a situation is unfulfilling, familiarity provides a sense of safety. Beliefs, habits, and identities form a structure that organizes meaning. When guidance challenges this structure, it is felt as confusion, loss, or inner turbulence. Disturbance is not evidence of misalignment, but of movement. Reassurance would keep the individual anchored to what they already know. Disruption forces attention toward what has been avoided or outgrown. Disruption exposes attachment. When something destabilizes emotional or psychological equilibrium, it reveals where identity has fused with circumstance rather than truth. A sudden connection, unexpected loss, or an inner calling that contradicts prior plans can feel like betrayal by the very force one hoped would protect them. Yet such moments compel a re-examination of values. They ask whether the life being lived is guided by habit or by authenticity. The psyche resists disruption because it threatens control. Control offers the illusion of safety, but it also limits depth. Guidance that arrives as disruption dismantles this illusion, not to punish, but to liberate. It introduces uncertainty so that choice becomes conscious rather than automatic. In this space, responsibility shifts inward. Instead of relying on external assurances, the individual must cultivate discernment, reflection, and trust in their own awareness. Disruption also sharpens perception. When life is smooth, attention narrows. When it is unsettled, awareness expands. The mind begins to question assumptions that were previously taken for granted. Emotional intensity brings suppressed material to the surface. What was once unconscious becomes visible. This exposure is uncomfortable, but it is precisely what allows integration. Guidance that reassures rarely penetrates this deeply. Guidance that disrupts demands engagement. There is a paradox at the heart of this process. What feels like loss is often the removal of something that no longer belongs. What feels like chaos is the reordering of inner priorities. The psyche mourns the familiar even when it has become limiting. Disruption honors growth by refusing to allow stagnation to masquerade as peace. Divine guidance does not impose clarity all at once. It creates conditions where clarity must be earned through presence and courage. The disruption slows automatic living and invites conscious participation. It asks not for blind faith, but for honest confrontation with fear, desire, and responsibility. In this way, disruption becomes a form of instruction. It teaches by experience rather than explanation, guiding the individual not toward comfort, but toward alignment with a deeper and more enduring truth. A powerful bond often creates urgency. The emotions feel vivid, compelling, and difficult to ignore, which can lead the mind to assume that immediate action is required. Yet intensity does not automatically demand impulse. Psychologically, the deeper purpose of such a bond is not reaction, but awareness. It exists to illuminate what is unconscious and to invite integration rather than to push the individual toward hurried decisions that bypass reflection and responsibility. When a connection activates strong emotion, it signals that something meaningful within the psyche has been touched. Desire, fascination, or emotional closeness arise because the bond resonates with inner material that has not yet been fully recognized. This material may include unmet needs, disowned traits, or unresolved conflicts seeking expression. Acting purely on impulse risks externalizing this inner content rather than understanding it. Awareness, by contrast, allows the individual to differentiate between projection and reality. Integration is a gradual process, It requires holding tension without collapsing into action or denial. The psyche must learn to contain contradictory feelings, attraction and fear, longing and restraint, excitement and uncertainty. This containment is not repression, it is conscious engagement. Through it, the individual gains insight into their motivations and patterns. The bond becomes a psychological space where inner opposites can be observed, understood, and eventually unified. Impulse seeks immediate relief from tension. It promises resolution through action, but often delivers repetition of old patterns. Many relationships fail not because the connection lacked meaning, but because it was rushed before its psychological significance was understood. When impulse governs behavior, the bond is used to escape discomfort rather than to learn from it. Awareness transforms the same discomfort into a source of self-knowledge. A bond oriented toward integration encourages responsibility. It asks the individual to consider not only personal desire, but also ethical impact, emotional maturity, and long-term consequences. This reflective stance does not diminish passion, it refines it. Prevents the bond from becoming a reenactment of unconscious dynamics, such as dependency, idealization, or self-abandonment. Instead, the relationship becomes a conscious encounter between two developing selves. Integration also involves reclaiming projected qualities. The other person may appear to hold vitality, courage, or depth that feels missing within oneself. Awareness reveals that these qualities are not owned by the other, but mirrored back to awaken them internally. As these aspects are integrated, the intensity of projection softens, allowing the bond to be seen more clearly. Whether the connection continues externally or completes its work internally, the individual emerges more whole. The purpose of the bond, then, is not to demand immediate fulfillment, but to expand consciousness. It slows the impulse to act so that insight can take root. In doing so, it honors the psychological truth that lasting transformation arises not from urgency, but from understanding. The bond becomes meaningful not because it was seized impulsively, but because it was met with awareness, patience, and integration. What ultimately matters is not whether this bond conforms to expectation, but whether it deepens consciousness. When met with awareness, it becomes a teacher rather than a temptation. It asks you to remain present, to listen beneath the noise of urgency, and to honor what is being revealed within you. In doing so, the connection fulfills its true purpose, not by demanding immediate action, but by guiding you toward greater wholeness, responsibility, and inner truth.